I'm standing here in a hollowed-out business located on Fort Myers Beach, a business and an entire community that was devastated by Hurricane Ian in late September. This community has suffered horribly from particularly storm surge, less so than hurricane force winds. That surge overtook this island in 10 to 14 feet of water depth, destroyed all of the businesses, and took many, many human lives.
Why are we having climate change? We're having it because we've had centuries of development where the production of energy was from carbon sources, coal, oil, and gas. It allowed us to build a wonderful economy that we all benefit from. But that release of carbon into the atmosphere has accelerated the impacts that we are now experiencing.
We're not just looking at how much sea level has risen on average. We're looking at the impacts on soil. We're looking at the impacts on one flower or plant species in the Sierra Nevada mountains, marching up that mountain. And we're thinking, well, why is it doing that? Well, it's because climate is changing.
We should have started 40 years ago. By stopping everything now won't end the problem. We're in for it. If we don't end it, it's going to be more and more and more beyond those levels.
When asked what the top challenges are for our region, the variable precipitation and definitely the heat. It's going to get really hot here, and heat kills people.
Workers that are exposed to outdoor environments in the daily basis, that varies from construction workers to farmer workers. So everywhere in Florida, we are facing those impacts.
Myself, as a farm worker, I've seen and experienced the rise in temperature firsthand. I've been working in the fields where a fellow farm worker passes out because it's too hot. Sometimes myself, I've gotten cramps working in the field. But there's really nothing you can do about that, because you don't want to go and speak out or not continue working, because if you do that, then you're not promised that the next day you're going to have a job, right? You don't want to build the reputation of being the person who can't handle this heat.
When you want to look locally, let's take South Florida, East or West Coast, you have to also add in the regional influences and flowing of the Florida current in the Gulf Stream, and the redistribution of mass. As ice melts, water's not attracted to that big mass, so it moves away. Those add in South Florida to our sea level rise. So a 5-foot sea level rise might become an 8 or 9 foot sea level rise. There are 2-foot intervals, and you can see how quickly the Naples area, Southeast Florida, Sanibel area is inundated. Here we're only at 8 feet and South Florida is gone.
A couple of the consequences of warming of the planet is an increase in sea level. Ice and glaciers melt, the volume of the oceans increases, and that causes high tides to become higher over time. The ocean has a great capacity to expand its volume and flood major portions of land. In addition, warming oceans fuel tropical storms and hurricanes. The warmer the water, the more intense the storms, the slower those storms move, so the greater impact they're likely to have on coastal communities. When you have a high tide because sea level has risen and you put storm surge on top of that, the capacity to flood and inundate a community becomes even greater. So it's that synergistic effect of sea level rise and storms that worries coastal communities around the planet, particularly here for us in Florida. We can see on the landscape as we move forward into the future where storm surge on top of sea level rise is likely to occur, and the maps are showing you those kinds of scenarios. The colors represent the extent and depth of flooding as we move forward into the future. The hotter the colors, the deeper the inundation. So we've replayed Ian's track and characteristics through that model, and that model then produced some pattern of storm surge and flooding depth around the Southwest Florida landscape. And you can compare what nature dealt us against what the model hindcasted, and the match was remarkable. So this tool that we now have in our hands here in Southwest Florida can be quite valuable in predicting, again, the impact of future storms with respect to surge and flooding. There will be portions of our landscape that will become uninhabitable. There'll be places on our landscape that may require communities to pack up and move and relocate.
There are things we can do about it, and all of us as individuals and companies and businesses and government, we have to get together to do what we need to do to stop as much as we can.
What we really need to do is be more responsible, be engaged, and stop consuming as much as we can, recycle not only the water, but recycle everything we have to actually be more sustainable. You know, we have no plan B, we only have one planet. We're not gonna go to Mars anytime soon and mess up another planet.
We should aggressively go after this right now. Changing our energy sources, planting trees, all these things that will help make a more habitable planet for ourselves and all our future generations.
To tackle climate change, what we're really going to have to do is have a paradigm shift in the way we use resources. All types of resources, from the consumer goods that we buy, purchase, and throw out, to water, to land. Ultimately, what we want to do is create a built environment that's a little bit denser. We can create really great places that are just a little more urban, a little more compact, and that will be a huge impact on our climate future.
Congress passed and the President signed the Inflation Reduction Act, and I believe that's the first piece of legislation, the first law that directly addresses mitigation by providing economic incentives for greener technology, for more efficient energy sources.
We have an active program of converting our fleet of county vehicles to electric vehicles, deploying solar on top of rooftops, floating solar arrays, capturing methane from our solid waste facilities. Everything we can do to reduce our carbon emissions.
We've been involved in a couple projects around environment the last couple years. One of them that we're very proud to be part of is Climate Solutions, where we're in collaboration along with the Collaboratory, FGCU, the Conservancy, and Eco America. The second project that we worked on were trees. We had the Botanical Garden grow for us 3,500 trees that we handed out to anyone in the community who wanted them.
Everybody can actually do his little piece. Whether you're vegetarian, whether you're making a home like mine, you know, you consume less, you downscale, all of those are very, very easy tips that everybody can do.
We're really lucky here in Southwest Florida. We have a group of high school students called the Youth Against Climate Change that were really inspired by the global youth movement around climate change and are doing what they can right here in Southwest Florida to inspire change in their communities.
Vote with your wallet. Support companies that have green policies.
Keep your thermostat at a moderate level.
Use public transportation or ride your bike.
Eat less beef, poultry, and dairy.
Drive an electric vehicle or hybrid.
Shop secondhand. Americans buy 68 new items of clothing each year.
Go solar if you can.
Plant trees. Reduce loans and fertilizers.
Elect green candidates. Become climate change ambassadors, like us.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage your MC for today, the Executive Director of the Water School at Florida Gulf Coast University, Dr. Greg Tolley.
Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to Casey Schulberg and his team. Casey, where are you out there? For this powerful video to set the stage for the events today. Good morning, and welcome to the Southwest Florida Climate and Community Initiative, and specifically the summit. As you can see from this powerful video, one of the things that we want you to come away from is the clear challenges that we are hoping to address today, and the clear challenges that we face as residents and visitors here in Southwest Florida. We also hope this inspires you to, for each of you to become a climate champion in whatever way that you can. This actually builds on something called the Water Summit, the Save Our Waters Summit that started in 2016. The news press came out with a plan to engage shareholders. I'm sorry, we've got a little glitch going on up here. To engage stakeholders around the state of Florida, mostly those who were involved in Everglades restoration, but those who were actually involved in protecting our water sources across the state of Florida. From that group, we actually formed the Southwest Florida Climate and Community Initiative. This is a collection of concerned organizations and businesses who believe that our region needs to work together and come together so that we can address some of our climate challenges. These organizations are committed to educating, to motivating, and uniting our community to find solutions and inspire action that will protect our shared environment, lifestyle, and economy. After the initiative was formed, the partners held interactive workshops. How many of you were actually at those workshops this last spring? Great. I see a lot of hands in the room here. These workshops help us to clarify the climate concerns and develop initial strategies for addressing the causes and impacts of a changing climate. And thanks to all of you who are here today that participated in those workshops. The takeaways from those meetings actually help form the event for today. They're shaping today's event. And thank you also to the Collier Community Foundation and the Collaboratory for hosting those events in the spring. Before we dive into today's program, I'd like to recognize the public officials that are joining us here today. Would all the public officials in the room please stand up for a second and be recognized? Wonderful. Thank you all for your dedication to our communities and for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. Next, I'd like to acknowledge the devoted environmental professionals and students that are here today from local nonprofit organizations, from FGCU and civic groups that have offered their time and expertise as part of this event. If you're a facilitator or note taker here with us today, will you please stand up? All right. Thank you very much for helping support this event this way with your time and efforts. Most importantly, today's event would not be possible without our sponsors. I would like to mention our sponsors here and then ask that you hold your applause until the end. First of all, our presenting sponsor, our main sponsor here today is Hertz. Our tabletop facilitator sponsor is the Water School at Florida Gulf Coast University. Our community conversations and ULI panel sponsor is the Collier Community Foundation. Our restorer sponsor is the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. Our food and drink sponsors are the Collaboratory and the Everglades Foundation. As I mentioned, Hertz, headquartered right here in Southwest Florida, is our generous presenting sponsor, a major sponsor for today's event. So I'd like to welcome Katie Leone from Hertz. She's the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility, to talk about what to expect in today's event. Katie?
Good morning. It's such an honor to connect with all of you today and for Hertz to support such an important summit in the community that we call home. We have a really, really great program ahead of us. As demonstrated in that opening video, and as all of you know firsthand, Southwest Florida is facing climate challenges and impacts today. We are still recovering both physically and emotionally from the devastating effects of Hurricane Ian. During the first hour of the program, you will hear more about the current state of affairs from scientists and policymakers from Florida Gulf Coast University's Water School and the city of Fort Myers Beach. Their expertise will further illustrate the urgency surrounding this topic. And while sufficiently tackling climate challenges may seem insurmountable, there are tremendous efforts already underway in our region to prepare and improve our resiliency. You will have the opportunity to hear from key experts around resiliency activities from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Coastal Heartland National Estuary Partnership, better known as CHNEP, the South Florida Water Management District, and the Everglades Foundation. Then we're gonna turn the mic over to all of you. Yes, you're not off the hook. You get to go in the driver's seat too. Because, one thing about climate change is that it is not a spectator sport. Everyone here in the room today has skills, talents, and expertise that we can harness to accelerate our region's resiliency tactics. We want your valuable insights to craft the strategies we need to deploy in order to effectively improve quality of life for Southwest Floridians and the millions of visitors who come here each year. So during the tabletop discussion portion of the agenda, our volunteer facilitators will engage you on critical topics such as adopting cleaner energy, promoting green business practices, minimizing risks with green infrastructure, and so much more. Your ideas will be synthesized and shared out during the plenary, which will be led by members of Florida State University's FCRC Consensus Center after a most fabulous vegetarian luncheon. Can't have a climate summit without good vegetarian food, right? During lunch, you could kick back and relax as you enjoy keynotes from experts from the City of Punta Gorda, GCU Homes, Babcock Ranch, the American Institute of Architects, and Growing Climate Solutions. Finally, leaders from the Collier Community Foundation, South Florida Water Management District, and the Conservancy of Southwest Florida will close out our day together. I hope you are all as excited as I am to learn alongside the experts lined up for you today and one another. It is just truly an honor for Hertz to sponsor today's activities. At Hertz, we are really committed to reducing the impact of our operations on the environment and the communities in which we do business. And we do this through implementing sustainable business practices and implementing community partnerships like this one today. We're also making a ton of investments in smart technologies that will drive the future of mobility. As transportation becomes more autonomous, connected, electrified, and shared, our company is really at the forefront of the generational shift that's going on in today's modern mobility ecosystem. We're investing in the largest electric vehicle rental fleet in North America via our agreements with Tesla, Polestar, and General Motors. And we're really looking forward to working with even more manufacturers over time. Almost all of them have commitments to this, and we're excited to see that. Hertz already has thousands of EVs available at more than 500 locations across 38 states. Our goal is for 25% of our fleet to be comprised of EVs by the end of 2024, and we will continue growing from there. We're just thrilled to be on the cutting edge of cross-industry efforts that are going to support the decarbonization of travel. Another program that many of you may not be familiar with that I wanted to share with you today is that our EVs are being deployed through a rideshare partnership that Hertz has with Uber. This offers flexible weekly contracts for Uber drivers, and they've been able to realize higher net incomes of 10 to 15% higher than what they might earn if they were driving a gasoline-powered vehicle. The partnership also benefits the consumers who are receiving premium driving experience and communities in the form of lower greenhouse gas emissions and improved air quality. It really demonstrates how people, planet, and profit are all just at the center of the agenda and how we could really drive solutions that pull those all together. And our approach to electrification at Hertz is really holistic. We're committed to contributing to the build out of charging infrastructure to power our fleet and support consumer adoption of electric vehicles. In fact, we've already installed over 2,200 charging stations in North America, and we're working with major energy companies like BP to further the build out of charging networks for consumers as well as the broader public. Our efforts to date have been realized thanks to our exceptionally talented workforce. Seeing the impact they make is truly an inspiration. We are making big bets and playing to win at Hertz, and I am confident that here in Southwest Florida we could do the same when it comes to implementing large-scale climate solutions. Thank you again so much for the privilege of being here today, and I'm going to turn the mic back over to Greg.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks. We're so grateful to Hertz for sponsoring the event here today. Now to lead us into the first section, I'd like to introduce Noah Valenstein. Many of you know Noah from his time as Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection in Florida. Noah is also the Chief Resilience Officer in the state. He's also currently serves as an advisor to the American Flood Coalition, and he's also a Presidential Fellow with Florida Gulf Coast University at the Water School. So please help me welcome Noah Valenstein to the stage.
Good morning. So thank you very much for the invitation today, and thank you, Greg. Thank you again, Hertz. I will sort of spoil the punchline of my presentation and say, I really believe transforming urgency into action is going to take business being able to easily and readily implement solutions. So the fact that we have a room today that looks more like a chamber room necessarily than an environmental conference, I think is very positive, because I truly believe when we see transformation in Florida, it's when it becomes ingrained in everyday business, in business and part of our economy. And so, but I want to talk a little bit about urgency. I feel like it's something that in the past 10 years I've specialized in my career, both working for Governor Scott and Governor DeSantis in politics and also with environmental groups and agriculture and others, is this idea that if we can frame, grasp, and push out urgency and why is an issue urgency, that we can solve it, right? That sort of key. You hear it. I remember in the governor's first, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but the governor's first transition, there was this idea of do more now for the environment, right? Capture the urgency, capture the reason that we should be pushing harder now and what that means for Florida. I think there's worth having the question of, is urgency enough? And that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit this morning, right? We have sold out crowd, 250 people. Don't think anyone here feels like this issue is not urgent, right? So if we have business leaders, community leaders, scholars, environmental organizations all coming to the room right now, pillars of our community, all feeling urgency. I think it's impossible to look at the video that started this conference and not have, the sense of urgency, maybe some trepidation, a little bit of fear. Why is that not enough? I think probably the elephant in the room is everyone here knows that you could walk out the doors, talk to another community leader, talk to a parent, a business owner, talk to a good friend, maybe talk to your spouse, and have them not in the same position, have them not feel that same urgency, have them not quite connect to the climate challenges that we're talking about today. And I think instead of simply looking at the urgency, and as so often in today's society, we take the path of, well, I'm right, here's the data, it's urgent, therefore you're wrong, let's move on and implement. And then we continue our argument from there. We have to be honest with ourselves enough to realize that that's the case. The environment, and I mean policy-wise in Florida, still has that divide. We need to recognize that, and we need to figure out how to take the urgency that we see and make it readily actionable and implementable and easy for your families, your businesses, your colleagues, your friends. And that's why I'm so excited about this conference, is that instead of just being talked at, that you have a chance to sit around the tables together and discuss how to make this urgency actionable and implementable and how it can transform your community. And to me, that's what success is going to take. And so I want to talk a little bit about that dichotomy, that tension here. I'm sure there are, you know, we'll avoid the Socratic method and make everyone raise their hands. But I know there are folks in this room that feel the urgency, and that urgency, instead of turning into action, has turned into frustration, anger, you know, maybe some despair, right? How do you take the dichotomy that we see here in Florida? Clear reasons, clear sense of urgency, but in some instances wanting to see more movement forward, and how do we act on it? What does it look like in Florida? Because I think Florida, and I will end, you know, my brief comments with the idea that I think in Florida, with this governor, but specifically in Southwest Florida, we have an opportunity now to take that urgency and do something that I don't think is possible anywhere else in this country, and possibly lead the world. And I think the time is now, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But to start, the state of Florida gives us a fighting advantage. You know, we have more people moving to Florida than anywhere else in the U.S. You know, we were just recently graced with that title in the recent census of having more folks move to Florida than any other state. Our population from 2021 to 2022 jumped by almost 2%. That's insane. We are almost now, we're above 22 million people in the state of Florida. By 2030, we will be projected to be more than 26 million people in the state of Florida. Right? It's scary when you can start throwing around jumps of a few million people, or talk about 2% on already more than 20 million, and have it sort of get lost in the numbers and size. And so I remind you, back in 1946, the state of Florida was only at 2.5 million people, right? We're preparing to see jumps of population larger than the entire population of the state of Florida in recent memory. At a time, while we're all talking about climate change and talking about a carbon neutral economy and talking about visioning for what we want to see in the future, you know, we're generally thinking back to a base point of pre-industrial revolution, or maybe just a memory you have from your childhood. But when you go back to that memory, we are now, again, growing as a society quicker than the state you lived in. So what's that mean for Florida? I mean, it means we've got a booming economy. We are a place that everyone wants to live, in large part because of our environment. Now look at a state. We've got, in one state, some of the most beautiful beaches in the world, ranked #1 by Dr. Beach almost every single year, somewhere in Florida, whether it's Anna Maria, whether it's Grayton Beach. We've got freshwater springs, a higher concentration than anywhere else in the world. Just absolute jewels of ecosystems here in Florida. We've got the Everglades, an international heritage site, one of the most pristine, you know, wetlands and amazing water bodies you could ask to have in a state. You've got amazing inland rivers and forests, all here in Florida, all driving our economy. It's why we want to live here, it's why we want to play here, it's why we want to move our business here. It also means our economy's been booming. If you look just at Miami-Dade alone, the GDP is larger than many countries in the world. They're in excess of $377 billion for a GDP for one municipality. That's mind-boggling. The state of Florida's budget just this past year exceeded $100 billion. That's not GDP, that's just annual appropriation. And so, with the idea that clearly it doesn't take amazing faculty and brilliant scientists, I think, for folks to understand that Miami, again, nearing up to $400 billion of GDP, is at risk of sea level rise. Just 3 feet of sea level rise would impact a GDP larger than many countries in the world. And so I think the data, and again, that urgency, the opportunity for that urgency is there. But again, why this disconnect? Why the pause? As some know, I've also had sort of in my schizophrenic job career, both politics, working on campaigns, being inside government, again, working with agriculture and environmental groups. I'm also married to a wonderful businesswoman, and she owns one of her companies is a polling company, and so occasionally we get to talk about polling, whether it's hers or some of her colleagues. And so she shared some polling with me recently, wasn't hers, but still said from a great group. And they had a couple questions regarding environment and climate change. The first was, do you believe that switching to a carbon economy will help or harm the environment? And do you have a worry about its impact to your economy? And so there was a discord. There were amongst one, and I hopefully we can all have a conversation in this room about different political parties and there not being a perfect match, and not, again, turn to blame, but use it as understanding. I think, again, that's the most difficult thing when you have urgency but not the solution, is that you are more incumbent on you to take a step back and listen and understand moving forward. But there was definitely a disconnect, you know? Among Republicans and even independents, there was a worry about the economy. There was a fear. More than 67% were worried that it would impact the economy and their well-being. Amongst the Democratic Party, other way around, 93% saw the urgency and were not worried about the impact to the economy. But shortly after that question, and I thought maybe that's somewhat predictable, I could see that, but shortly after that question, there was a question about which of the following do you most blame for Florida's homeowners insurance rates, right? There should be something that all Floridians can get behind and be angry at. And so there was a long list, as pollsters sometimes like to do. You know, let's throw out a nice 10 items to go through and see what we can get. And so I'll just give you a few of them. One was natural disasters. One was insurance company greed. I figure that should always get number one. And then the other was just lack of regulation, not necessarily insurance company greed and so on. And so in this, interestingly, Republicans, their number one source of concern was natural disasters. Greed was there, right? But not as high. It was still high in Democrats too, but not as high. Greed there was number one in the Democrat answers. But both saw, it was sort of the closest consistency there was a recognition that natural resources, natural disasters were really impacting a way of life and environment in Florida. And so where does that get us? What can we take away from that? And can we make this urgency actionable, meaningful, and make progress in Florida? And I'd say I think there's something to learn there, that when talking about a natural disaster, that it brought folks together. But let me first start with what I think is an amazing ray of hope, which is the last term of the governor and then the beginning of this term. So Governor DeSantis, in his second week of office, came down just north of here, and in a rare move for a governor anywhere, even in Florida, did an executive order outlining his commitment to the environment. And actually took time to talk about resilience, took time to start up a resilience program, created a chief science officer, created a chief resiliency officer, made a commitment to more than $2.5 billion over his first term. I think some of you probably have already seen articles from last week where, again, in his second week in his second term, came down and did the same thing. I think surprised a lot of folks that he was willing to sort of raise the bar on himself and still challenge this issue. So did something actionable? Well, let's use that as an example. Were we able to take actionable steps from that urgency? Because clearly there was urgency in the governor's words there. And I think my answer would be yes, right? The fact that we've got a chief resiliency officer in statute, right? It means that now when we had a storm like Hurricane Ian, after these executive orders and after those commitments, we had a chief resiliency officer at our emergency operations station here in Lee County, Collier County, but in Lee County north of us. We had a chief resiliency officer going around with the governor to the state, touring and looking at the impacts from that hurricane and making the connection in every instance as to how resilience could help us build back better. We had a chief science officer, our first one now working at the University of South Florida, now setting up the flood hub, making sure that we're collecting accurate data and data specific to Florida that will actually help us to have actionable steps on sea level rise. I think all these things show that we can, in a very short term, turn urgency into action. And lastly, I'd say you had significant funding that wasn't funding for funding's sake, but funding that actually led us in a very short term, and not to steal the Deputy Secretary's thunder, but get in a position where every coastal county now is in the process or had already done a resiliency adaptation plan. And that we can, in each of our communities throughout Florida, have science-based conversations about what an impact is going to be and what a community should do. There is also the largest amount of money ever for being able to move from that and build projects. And so I'll end with, well, what does that mean for us today in your breakout rooms, and why do I think Southwest Florida is so special and at that point where we can lead the nation? As we rebuild from Hurricane Ian, as we rebuild here in Florida, at this sort of turning point of a discussion of resilience and climate change, I think that is the area, the conversation about how are we rebuilding our community, how are we building smarter, how are we taking the lessons we have about a more carbon neutral or about a more resilient economy and community and implement them, is really going to be the turning point here in Florida. And it's going to be the conversations in this room that take that and implement it. So with that, thank you very much. And I'd like to next invite up Dr. Savris.
Good morning, everybody. Good to be here. Thank you for being here. And Noah, thanks for those wonderful words and for getting us started. I'm new to the podium. Can I bring up my oh, you're bringing up my PowerPoint. Thank you. And am I changing? The little changer has disappeared. I'll just get started and see what happens. Anyway, I can't see you. The lights are bright in my eyes, but I know you're out there. I can't tell if you're awake or falling asleep. So occasionally laugh or chuckle at my silly little comments so that I know I'm not up here for no apparent reason. I am Mike Savris. I'm a geologist, fundamentally a coastal geologist, and I've been working here in Southwest Florida since coming to Florida Gulf Coast University in 1997. And I was asked to talk a little bit about how Hurricane Ian might enlighten us. First, let me acknowledge my co-presenters. Dhruv Butt is a colleague and friend at the Water School. He's our GIS geospatial analyst. I'm working closely with two people from the University of Florida, Peter Shang and Vladimir Paramigan. They are the computer modelers and engineers that have helped generate the tools that we're hoping to use here in Florida. And then a friend and colleague from Temple University, Ilya Bunevich, who's another coastal geologist and has brought other geophysical tools to Southwest Florida to help us understand what's going on. I've sort of nicknamed Hurricane Ian as the storm that came too early. You know, this conference was originally scheduled for October 7th, and that conference was planned somewhat differently than the one you're experiencing today. And then, of course, Ian came along and refocused us and changed our priorities. My mom used to say, if God gives you lemons, why don't you go ahead and make lemonade? And I would argue now, after having a couple of months since Ian's passage, that Ian should be our lemon, and we have an opportunity here to make lemonade. What are the lessons we can learn, okay, from Ian to help us move forward as we deal with the challenges of becoming more resilient to climate change's effects? The next slide, or can I advance to the next slide? Okay, you are seeing what I'm seeing. Great. Let me just quickly talk to you about the two kinds of research efforts that I'm going to communicate to you today. These are two research efforts that are going on through the Water School and involve collaborators from those institutions that I just met. One of the things we're doing at the Water School is we're trying to look at the history of coastal development, the geological history, the last 5,000 years specifically. And you can use that information to predict how Southwest Florida's coastal history is going to project, okay? And we can use that information to assess the resilience capacity that our coastal environments have, and to hopefully build that capacity as we move forward in time. So I'm going to show you some information where we've actually looked at Hurricane Ian's impact on the coast and how we can use that to build greater resilience. The second, we've been working principally with the University of Florida at developing tools to predict Southwest's vulnerability to nuisance flooding, thus the sunny day flooding that comes at us with higher high tides because of sea level rise, and storm surge, the kind of impact that we experienced during Ian. And many of you in the room are familiar with a particular tool set called a Coon, and I'd like to bring you up to speed on that as well. Next slide. How do you connect what we experienced late in September of this year with climate change? Wasn't Ian just another run-of-the-mill storm? Florida's been impacted by tropical storms and hurricanes since long before carbon emissions have changed the composition of our atmosphere. Well, as it turns out, that climate change exacerbates storminess. As you warm the oceans, as you warm sea surface temperature, you fuel tropical storm development. That means storms of higher intensities and rapid intensification, rapid fueling of those storms. Storms have a tendency to move forward more slowly. That increases the potential for greater storm surge and greater wind damage. Larger storms, the storms are becoming larger as a consequence of climate change, and for that reason are packing more precipitation. And Ian, as it turns out, exemplifies all of these characteristics. The next slide shows you an image of Hurricane Ian making landfall in Cayo Costa at 3:05 p.m. on September 28th. This is a little bit about Ian's biography, just to get you situated and have a better fundamental understanding of the storm. It made landfall on September 28th. It was a strong Category 4 storm with 150 mile per hour sustainable winds at a low pressure of 940 millibars. And it was moving, particularly at this instant, as you can see in this video, moving very, very slowly at 8 miles an hour. You look at the size of this storm, the entire state is impacted with the exception of the westernmost part of the Florida Panhandle. It emerged from Cuba as a Category 2 and then it quickly fueled to a Category 4, almost a Category 5 by the time it made landfall. And as it turns out, Southwest Florida had the misfortune of being located east of the eye during the entire storm's progression, meaning we had onshore winds for the entire period of time. In essence, all of these characteristics can be attributed to the exacerbation related with climate change. The figure on the left shows you the storm track as it made landfall across Cuba and then Florida. The map on the right shows you the wind distributions of that storm. You can see that orange area in the center is where the most intense winds are. If you just advance the slide one step, you can see that's the circulation of the center of the storm. Advance it one more step again, and that's what generated the prolonged and extensive onshore winds that contributed to the extensive storm surge. That, in essence, was our devil in the making, those onshore winds. Let's move on to the next slide. Let me talk to you a little bit about the methods of how we're going about assessing Ian's geomorphological impact. Geomorphology is just a fancy word of saying the shape of the coast. How has Ian changed the topography of that coast? We're employing two types of technologies. The first one is called ground penetrating radar, which allows you to look below the surface of the beach and see what history exists in the structures below the surface. Not going to talk much about that, but this particular tool can be very illuminating in helping understand where are the hot spots, where are the places we're likely to see repetition of these kinds of impacts. We're also employing drones, a UAV-based LiDAR system. LiDAR is a radar technology that allows you to reconstruct topographies and create what are known as DEMs, or digital elevation models. We had the good fortune of flying our drone with this LiDAR device before the storm in many areas, and then we were able to fly it again after the storm, giving us a before and after glimpse. We're able to, from those images and from those data, quantify how much sediment was lost or gained. We can actually quantify erosion and determine where the erosional areas existed. And that allows us to provide some information about the resilience capacity of different coastal segments. What portions of Sanibel are more vulnerable? What portions of Naples, for example, might be more resilient? I should also mention that a number of national granting agencies have made rapid funding available to us. The FGCU Water School has received a number of these rapid response awards, and we have some money coming to us from Florida Sea Grant to help further what you're going to see today beginning on February 1st. The map on the right, you can see lots of colored polygons, lots of rectangles. These are the areas where we currently have drone mapping information as a consequence of Ian. And by the time we're done, hopefully by the time the end of February rolls around, we'll have the entire coast mapped. Next slide. Just a quick glimpse at the technologies. The one on the left, that's my friend Ian and me on the right, romantically walking on the beach, not walking our dog, but walking a ground-penetrating radar antenna. Not quite the same as the dog, but you don't have to pick up anything after it passes. On the right, you'll see our drone pilot and technician, that's Struve. That's our baby, or it was our baby. That drone, unfortunately, has been retired. And that's the device that flies the LiDAR sensor and is providing you with the data you're going to see in just a minute. Next slide. I want to show you 3 types of findings that this work has revealed and show you a little bit about how we can learn from that information. When storm surge comes in, okay, we call that flood surge. Okay, the flood surge coming in was remarkably high, okay, and we had the waves set up on top of it. It's the waves on top of the storm surge that cause the erosional damage. Well, it turns out that that incoming surge was so high that the entire island and dunes were overtopped or overwashed, and that caused a wholesale sediment movement onto the mainland behind the foredune. The foredune is the wall, I forget what we call it, the castle wall that's protecting the coast, so to speak. Okay, that foredune was overtopped, and those dunes were either destroyed or deflated. That's why the city of Naples, the city of Sanibel, the town of Fort Myers Beach, received so much sediment within their city streets because of that incoming surge. Next slide. It's the outgoing surge, though, the ebb surge, that really created the havoc. The outgoing surge height was lower than the incoming and caused wave-induced erosion. And that movement of water off the islands and back to the Gulf of Mexico cut these immense drainage channels that actually incised or cut through the sediment that was deposited on the way in. And it turns out that those channels preferentially formed along devegetated paths and between foundation footprints. That's just a fancy way of saying anywhere somebody put a footpath across the dunes, that's an area where one of these surge channels formed. Any home that happened to reside between 2 concrete pads happened to be an area where a surge channel formed. Next slide, I'm going to show you some of the data, and I don't have a pointer, so some of this may be hard to see. But in this and the next few images, you're going to see maps. This is a map of what the southernmost region of Sanibel Island looked like when the LiDAR was flown sometime after Hurricane Irma in 2018. And the colors you're seeing here represent topography. So hot colors represent high areas in meters above sea level, and cold colors represent shallow areas, again, in meters below sea level. This is what the Tarpon Bay Road beach looked like before Ian. If you advance to the next slide, okay, you can see the surge ebb channels forming across the landscape. Again, you can't see it, but behind this image, if you look at the aerial photography taken before Hurricane Ian had made landfall, every one of those surge channels sits on top of an area that was a devegetated path. Next slide, advance once, advance again. And again, I'm just skipping over stuff, and I'm sorry I can't do this myself. Anyway, so we have a situation where lots of sediment got brought in, and then the returning surge cut these erosional channels on the way out. Next slide. This is probably the island that was most devastated by Hurricane Ian. This is Lover's Key. Here we had an opportunity to fly the LiDAR in May, just before the storm, and this drone flight was done after Ian on October 19th. Lover's Key is a troubled island. It's an island that has had poor resilient capacity since as long as I've been here, and I suspect that this particular storm may have done it in perhaps for the last time. Here you can see there are high areas. You can see the red representing what was left of the foredune back in early 2022. Before you advance the slide, just concentrate on those high areas, the areas that are yellow and red. Those are areas that were well above sea level before the passage of Ian. If you move forward a slide, you can see just how devastated that island was. There are numerous surge channels that have cut through. A new inlet was cut through by the boardwalk there, very much on the right. And this is kind of a hard set of circumstances to recover from, going to require massive restoration effort. Next slide. And again, okay, and next again one more time. I thought I'd show you a couple of pictures of what these ebb surge channels look like. The image on the left is taken from Lover's Key. You can see that deep cut cutting across the island. The one on the right is from Tarpon Bay Road Beach from the map you just saw a few minutes ago. And there's up to a meter and a half of erosion caused by that surge. Okay, next slide. Don't really have time to go into this, but that ground penetrating radar technology, you can see one of the traces, what the subsurface looks like. So if you imagine taking a slice through the beach at Lover's Key, okay, down into the surface, down 3 or 4 meters, this is what you would see. The area there that's highlighted in light blue represents an ancient scour channel. And it turns out that we're finding these ancient scour channels in the same areas that were scoured during Ian. So there's this repetition of scour along certain portions of our coast, and there are certain areas of our coast that haven't experienced that scour. Again, a lesson we can hopefully take to the bank. Next slide. The second finding, one more again. Oops, back up one, sorry. Second finding, seawalls can be your friend. They can also do quite harm. It turns out that seawalls held their ground in many locations and they failed in others. Interestingly, the city of Naples discovered the existence of buried historic seawalls when they were exhumed by Ian. I was told by their natural resources people that they've actually identified former seawalls because they were uncovered during the passage of this storm. Wherever there was a seawall that remained in place, there was extensive erosion out in front of that seawall, creating a depression on the back of the beach. The next slide shows you, this is Fort Myers Beach. From the central part of the island, you can see Newton Beach Park there in the center. Okay, this is what Fort Myers Beach looked like in 2018. And then if you advance one slide, okay, you can see in the northeast, on your upper left, you can see the surge channels forming. Those surge channels formed on parts of Fort Myers Beach that didn't have seawalls, okay? If you focus your attention on the southeast portion, that's a place where there are seawalls and a place where you can see a very low area, a light blue trench, if you will, sitting out in front of the seawall that held its ground. If you advance one slide and advance again, okay, you can see a place where there was frontal erosion associated with seawalls that remained in place, and a portion of this part of Fort Myers Beach where this ebb channelization occurred because there was no protective seawall. Okay, next slide. And our friends in Naples, I want to quickly show you some of the information there. This is a LiDAR image flown from 2018. This is the Naples Pier area before Ian. When you advance the slide once, okay, see the yellow straight line? Can you back up one? Okay, watch how the yellow that is straight, go forward one. Now you have a new straight line that's yellow. That's the old seawall giving way and the old seawall that was exhumed by the passage of Hurricane Ian. And then out in front of that yellow straight line that's running right to left, you can see a deep green trench. That's the area of erosion that occurred out in front of the seawall. So, next slide. Here's what some of those images look like. On the left is the erosion in front of the seawall on Fort Myers Beach. That's just southeast of Newton Park. And there you can see erosion out in front of a seawall on Naples Beach near the pier. Okay, the third set of findings. It turns out that there are certain portions of the coast that are remarkably resilient, and these are the places we might model our management and restoration activities after. There are these things called strand plains. These are areas of the coast that have actually grown or prograded seaward over time. They've added new dune ridges as we've moved forward over the last few decades. Those strand plains provide greater width and protection for the developed coast behind it. It turns out that Sanibel, North Captiva Island, and Cayo Costa all have these strand plains on them. We haven't done any work yet on North Captiva and Cayo Costa. We've had a hard time getting access out there, but we have had a chance to look at the strand plains' effects on Sanibel, and they've done the strand plains done a remarkable job on Sanibel of sort of protecting the coast. The next slide shows a map view, a satellite view of the strand plain. Advance one more slide. There's the strand plain. There's the width of the strand plain from the developed margin all the way to the beach, and you can see all of those yellow lines. Those yellow lines represent formal coastal positions, and as you move from the upper right to the lower left, this island has grown since the mid-1990s. The next slide shows you the digital elevation models, the topography. This was our flight flown on September 7th before Ian. You can see the red spots represent the existing ridges of the Strand Plain. The green areas represent the troughs between the ridges. The next slide then shows what it looks like after Ian. There's one ebb surge channel forming there, but otherwise there are no ebb surge channels on this portion of the beach. And it turns out that those ridges and swales on the Strand Plain remained relatively unaffected. Again, an area that hasn't experienced the kind of scour in the past, and this part of Sanibel is doing and has done historically remarkably well. Okay, move ahead. Another slide, another slide. Okay, let me change gears really quick and talk to you about the second aspect of the research our water school is involved with, and that's the development of a toolkit for assessing vulnerability to flooding due to both sea level rise and storm surge. Many of you have heard the term ACOON. ACOON is an acronym that stands for the Adaptation of Coastal and Urban Natural Ecosystems. It's essentially a mapping visualization tool that uses computer modeling to predict exactly where the flooding is going to be in the future. It's founded on something called a CH3D SWAN modeling core, but it's got lots of sophisticated side-on models that are added to it. And it's done, we assumed it would do remarkably well at predicting the future. ACOON now exists for Collier County exclusively, a more higher resolution version of ACOON, and now we have ACOON for the entire Southwest Florida region, bringing in the 3 counties. I'm going to show you some imagery from from that new visualization package. And ACOON can also be used or adapted for rapid forecasting. Actually use it in advance of a storm to get a better sense of where the storm surge might sit. The next slide shows you an image of, this is the ACOON view map for 2040. This is from all of Southwest Florida. I've just focused in here on Lee County's communities. You can see Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel, Cape Coral, and so on. This is a simulation of what 2040 looks like, assuming sea level has gone up 20.5 centimeters, okay, as we move forward into 2040. And what you're seeing here is the number of days where there is 1 foot or more of inundation on the landscape. So this is nuisance sunny day flooding. Okay, how many days during a year are you likely to see water on the landscape, assuming we realize this 20.5 centimeter rise in 2040? And you can see there's a lot of red on this landscape. Those red areas represent places where there's between 350 and 365 days of wetness during the year. That means nuisance flooding every day throughout a year's time. The next slide shows the same thing. This is for 2070, a little further into the future. This is for Collier County with Marco Island, Everglades City, and the city of Naples. This is 2070, assuming there's a 38 centimeter rise in sea level. And here again is the number of days where there's standing water on the landscape of 1 foot or more. I think somebody held up a hand. I gotta go faster. Okay, the good news is that I'm almost done. The next slide, there needs to be some good news in the room today. And I guess maybe the best news is I'm almost done, as I waste another 30 seconds of your time. Okay. Here's the ACOON viewer for all of Southwest Florida, focusing on Lee County. But this looks at 2040 with about a 20.5 centimeter sea level rise and that 1 in 100 year storm surge sitting on top of it. So you can use the viewer to anticipate and plan for adaptation planning as you move forward into the future. Now, admittedly, we just went through a storm. Okay? It would have been nice to have had these tools fully in place before the storm. Okay? So one of the lessons here, one batch of the lemonade, I would argue, is that I'm going to show you now that ACOON as a modeling tool does a remarkably good job, and this should be something the community rallies around to anticipate the effects of the next storm and as we move forward into the future. So the next slide, Ian gave us an opportunity to test how well ACOON worked. How well does the CH3D SWAN model work at forecasting the future, okay? And this is a phenomenon that computer modelers call hindcasting, okay? You know where Hurricane Ian went, okay, you can take the track and characteristics of Ian and run it through the model, okay, after it happened, and then you can compare what we really saw on the landscape against what the model would have predicted, okay? So you're predicting what Ian would have done in a hindcasting mindset, and you're comparing that against real data. And that's what I'm going to show you here. On the left, you can see a map that shows what the CH3D SWAN model showed for inundation for Southwest Florida early on the morning of 9/28 when Ian made landfall. And you can see the distribution of surge heights in feet. Red, hot colors are deeper, cool colors are lower. Okay? How does this compare against what we actually saw? The next slide shows you some of the data. Hard to digest. Again, I don't have a pointer, but what I can at least describe is on the left, you're looking at the NOAA tide gauge stations, one that existed on the Naples Pier but was annihilated during Ian. And below that is the NOAA tide gauge station in Fort Myers, right along the river. You can see in blue are the measured tide heights through the passage of Ian, and the red represents the simulated tide heights that the Akun visualization package demonstrated. And you can see the curves match remarkably well. Okay. If you look to the right, after the storm, a number of us, a team from FGCU, went out and measured storm surge inundation depth at many places around the 3 counties. Okay? And then we compared those against the inundation depths that the CH3D SWAN model predicted. You can see red and blue dots there. Along the x-axis is the value we measured, and along the y-axis is the depth that the model simulated. And if those data follow a nice straight line, and they do, that tells you that what was predicted or simulated matches what was actually observed. And that line is pretty tight. Next slide, and the last slide. Akun works well. The hindcasting results demonstrate that. It's quite reliable for assessing the vulnerability of Southwest Florida as we move forward in the future. I think we can be confident that it will do a decent job. And it could also be used and adapted to supplement emergency management decisions in the front of a storm. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. Next slide, and just thank one more slide forward. Just like to thank lots of people. The last bullet here about our hearts going out to the Southwest Florida coastal communities. It was really strange to be out there measuring the height of inundation depth when you're asking a homeowner to measure the mud line on the side of their house after they had lost just about everything inside of it. And it was a really sort of emotional time. And with that, I thank you.
Our next speaker today is Bill Veach. Bill is a council member with the Fort Myers Beach, and Bill's going to be talking to us about some challenges and opportunities with respect to rebuilding. Thank you, Bill.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to kind of talk about some of my personal experiences through the storm and then some of the things we've learned from it. A lot of you know Fort Myers Beach. Of course, this was taken before the storm. I was asked about how well prepared we were. Now, when we have a house, this house, we found newspapers in the walls from 1932. It had been through a lot of storms. It's on the beach. You can see the beautiful old Florida house, and you can see we put things up on top of tables, thinking that would be the safest place. You might get some flooding, but at least things like carpet and stuff would be taken off of the floor. This is the outside of the house before the storm. This was, this is a video, but I guess the video isn't going to play. This is taken by some security cameras I had in the house just about when the power went off around 11 o'clock in the morning. This was still when there was a fairly low tide. This is what we were doing during the storm. And if I was going to title this photo, I'd probably call it "Ignorance is Bliss." We were in a hotel room. The first floor had flooded. The top floor had been evacuated because the roof was compromised. We had no power. We had no electricity. Well, no electricity. We had no water. We had no television. We had no internet. those of you anywhere else but close to Fort Myers Beach had better information about what was going on than we did. But we had wine. This is what the house looked like afterwards. All those, the house was sitting on the wood frame there. There was a fireplace over to the right. The structure that's left was a garage that was built about 5 years ago to the modern code. And I think speakers will talk about this later. So the house that had been through many hurricanes, the old house, we think most of it's in the back bay, completely overwashed through the island. We found portions of the deck on the last house before the bay, and sections here and there in some neighbors' houses. But the upstairs, built to code, was dry. The things that were up there were safe. The windows and doors all worked, and is still a fully functioning structure. I was asked about, were we prepared for the storm? And I can say yes and no. No, because it's hard to build structures in advance of a storm that are going to withstand the storm. Now, as Mike said, this is a storm that came too early. We were in the process of building a new rec center that would have been built to code, which would have withstood the storm. We were probably a year or so away from getting that built. Without that, we had no infrastructure. The town hall, this is day one after the storm. Now, I have a 4-wheel drive truck that survived the storm for like 3 or 4 weeks. We had 6 miles of this kind of road with this kind of debris. There were household items, there were bits of houses, there were power lines, there were cars. Down at the south part of the island, about 5 miles away from where this photo was taken, was where there was a lot of condos, and there were people who stayed in the condos who needed rescuing. But it took us a good day and a half to clear this road of debris before emergency vehicles could get to the south part of the island. You couldn't come from the south onto the island because the bridges were compromised. This is our town hall. Now, I came out with the town manager. He wanted to get to the town hall. We managed to get 2 doors in to the island. I got 2 flat tires, and we walked the rest of the way. The town hall was completely destroyed. For the first week, our command center was a folding table with patio chairs underneath one of those gazebos, those Walmart gazebos. That was our command center. How we were prepared for this, though, was our previous town manager had staged heavy equipment to clear the road days before the storm. They were in a safe place, and within the first day after the storm, we already had equipment clearing that road to get to the people in the south. These are houses that are close to where mine was, and these are built to modern codes. And people complained about the large houses in Fort Myers Beach, but these acted the way they're supposed to act. When I was told, when I was building my garage by the contractor, that you put block walls up that are meant to withstand hurricane winds, but then will crumble with storm surge. And also the cinder blocks don't go very far, so they don't contribute to the debris that did so much damage during the storm. I was skeptical. After the storm, I'm completely sold with the modern building codes. It's exactly what happened to these buildings. They broke through. If there were some items downstairs that were being stored, they became part of the debris field. Otherwise, everything stayed very local, and these places were up and running fairly quickly after the storm. This is what happens with a lot of the debris. This was in front of a friend of mine's house. In the front yard, she had someone else's house. On the street in front of her house, she had another person's house. And underneath all that debris was my kayak. So debris is a big issue. And in some ways, I was fortunate that we were on the coast, because I didn't have to go into a house and muck out all that toxic sludge. Everything just washed away. But all the parts of my house and all the things that I had stored were in someone else's yard or could have damaged someone else's house. It's an important part of this new design, is not just to withstand the storm, but not cause damage to other people's properties. So immediately, in our recovery, there was multiple phases. The first stage we really had was trying to rescue people, trying to allow our emergency vehicles to get into places where people needed help. That took a few days. Then we had a week or so of search and rescue where there was a lot of people on the island. The fire department came to us and said, It's inhibiting their ability to go and complete their search and rescue because the transient nature of people coming and going made it hard for them to clear areas. So we closed down for it was a little over a week. Took a lot of abuse from people who really wanted to get in their house, but it was very important. They rescued hundreds of people. Some of them were life-saving. Some were people who were stuck in a high-rise with no elevator and didn't have the physical means to get down the stairs. Then the next thing that came up, and a lot of these are overlapping because not everyone had the same level of damage. There were people who stayed during the storm, stayed after the storm, and were desperate for food and water and other things. We also had people who needed rescuing. We didn't really know what their conditions were. So the next stage was to get food and water and basic sanitation set up in set locations along the beach. After that, we wanted to be able to get water and power to people's houses so they could continue to live, if they're going to live there, to live more self-sustaining lives. That was done. It's still going on, but for the most part, most of that was done pretty quickly. Then we were still stuck with sitting at a table with chairs and a little gazebo outside of town hall. So we needed to come up with an interim town hall, which we're still working with. Every few weeks, we get something new from some agency, and then they take it away and we get something else. Right now, we're having our meetings in a tent. So being prepared for a storm really requires a lot of foresight because there's no way you're going to construct a building when a storm is approaching. Like I said, the town was 1 year away from having this rec center, which could have been a command center and would have been designed for it. We also had recent improvements we did, which were very important to the outcome. We had a new stormwater, a new sewer, water, and the Sierra Road was recently redone with curb and gutters when before it just was an asphalt road, 2-lane asphalt road with a sand shoulder on either side. My feeling is when you saw some of Mike's pictures of the scour, that if we didn't have that road, the scour would have broken through through our road and would have made the rescue and the recovery much more difficult. One of the big questions that people have is, what about the 50% rule and what it means from FEMA? And for those of you who don't know, 50% rule is saying that if you have significant damage, which is more than 50% of the assessed value of the structure, then you have to raise it up to the flood codes. Raising things up, this is FEMA's way of slowly getting us up to being a resilient community. Now, Ian accelerated that because a lot of these houses were washed away, or a lot of them were nowhere close to the 50% rule, so they will be built up. Now, one of the problems is these houses are very expensive. My garage was very expensive to build for such a small space. There's a lot of people who can't afford that, who just are living in a small cottage. One of the beauties of Fort Myers Beach was those old cottages that have been around for a long time, that were reasonably priced, and you could get all demographics of people there. And what I call building Darwinism. So the buildings that were weak were destroyed. The buildings that were strong are still there. We also have, I've been told, we have, it's an opportunity for an old town that was built in bits and pieces like Fort Myers Beach was, to come up with a clean slate, to redo some of our town planning, to really make a leap in the design of a town that we didn't have before. And we are working towards that. Some of the effects of the storm are much more than just the physical property. This graph about population is a little misleading because I think they had to correct when they did the census. But our population has declined from 2010 by about 15%. We are a moderately affluent, older town. And our elementary school lost 30% of its student body from this storm, from people who had to leave out of the school zone far enough where they couldn't attend the school. Now, what these numbers mean to me is that a lot of our population is older, and I've heard from numerous people that they just, at that stage in life, they don't want to spend the years it takes to rebuild, and they are moving on. Other people are retired people who moved down, like me, honestly, during the 2010 depression in the prices, and these are retired school teachers, just your average people. A lot of them can't afford to rebuild. It's just beyond their means. So those things are really going to have a dramatic effect on the community, and what takes their place is not really known now. So, like I said, pre-in, one of the things that attracted me to Fort Myers Beach was the diversity of people. That the neighborhood, when we hung out on the beach, watched the sunset, they were everywhere from hairdressers to business people to everything. It was a beautiful community, and that's really what attracted me. Some are going to leave, some are fighting to stay, and some are solid. But I can honestly say our sense of community is stronger after the storm than it was before the storm. I just hope that the what comes next, that people can actually be able to stay and keep that community strong. We've already seen that, one of the challenges too we have is you can build a house in the V zone, the velocity zone, which is close to the coast, which is where you saw like our structure as a resident, and the stairs are cumbersome, but it's doable. It's more of a challenge for retail operations because you're going to be hard pressed to get someone to walk up a flight and a half of stairs to just see what's in your window at your retail shop. That is a real challenge to us, try to find solutions. And there are not inexpensive solutions. There's a lot of unfeasible solutions, but I haven't found one that's really inexpensive. We're already finding too that our housing market, people are selling destroyed houses for $700,000-800,000. So if anything, it seems to have increased the prices, that people have an anticipation of what Fort Myers Beach is going to be that is optimistic. We also have issues with short-term rentals. Now, there's been recent stories in the local Fort Myers paper about short-term rentals and about their effect on the affordability of housing. It's one of the leading causes, according to a Collier County meeting they just had, was that short-term rentals and gated communities that don't allow rentals are some of the biggest drivers for affordability. We've seen a huge surge in short-term rentals since the VRBO type businesses started 13 years ago. And with this too, some of the least expensive houses, some of the more affordable ones are the ones that got washed away. And the ones that are going to be rebuilt, they can cost anywhere from $700 to $1,000 a square foot, which is prohibitive to probably making those into affordable housing. The only way really to ensure we have some housing is with our town coming up with a plan that incentivizes people to do that. Now, there are opportunities. There's some kind of planning terms, like one is the 15-minute city, which is where you say that everybody is within 15 minutes of some commercial, some retail, some restaurants, whatever. We can do that in Fort Myers Beach because we have these little pocket commercial districts that are up and down the street, which have now been completely destroyed. And there's an opportunity with planning to do some mixed use for those and to encourage development in that area so that we become a more bicycle and pedestrian friendly area. And as you already know, if you go to Fort Myers Beach, we're still a very car-dominated society, and the way we are. There's no real easy way to get in Fort Myers Beach without a car, although transit opportunities are there if we can push those through. And the other we have, which is an odd benefit, is expensive parking. Because if parking is expensive, people are more likely to carpool with their friends before they come down or find alternative ways to get to the beach. There's also some approaches that are particularly well suited for Fort Myers Beach, and one is called lean urbanism. And the idea of lean urbanism is that the town would come up with a template. So you have a collection of incentives to make people put workforce housing, do some mixed use, develop where you want to, but then you bundle those up, you come up with a template, and you basically tell a property owner, if you follow this template, then you have a quick path towards approval. You don't need necessarily hire lawyers to argue with the town. You don't need to hire architects to come up with the whole plan and consult with you. That if you're a small property owner, that you don't need to sell to a big property owner, that we're providing you a pathway to be able to develop in a way that is favorable for the town going forward and that is doable for someone who's a small property owner. And that's pretty much my presentation.
Thank you, Bill and Mike and Noah, for your valuable insights, and Bill, especially for your firsthand perspective of what happened here in Southwest Florida during Ian. In our next session, you're going to be hearing about some current resilience activities from 4 professionals in the region. These activities are occurring throughout the state and the region. First up is, there we go, Deputy Secretary Adam Blaylock is here with us today. He's Deputy Secretary with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Adam is responsible for overseeing statewide water supply and infrastructure, restoring and protecting Florida's aquatic ecosystems, including the Everglades, managing and monitoring aquatic research, and policy governing coastal protection and resiliency. I assume you have some help with that, right? Okay, with all of that, yeah. We're very grateful that Adam was able to make some time for us today to talk about preparing Florida for a resilient and sustainable future. Adam?
All right, can you hear me okay? All right. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here to get to talk to you all on everything that the state of Florida is doing for, addressing the impacts of sea level rise and flooding in the state of Florida. Even though I could spend all day bragging on all the work that the department does, it's not just DEP. A lot of resilience activities happening at DOT and some of the other agencies that we work with too. And it's really been a pretty remarkable, last 2 years and really last 4 years working with the department on these issues and getting to see a lot of the progress that has been made. As Noah alluded to, has really kind of kicked off in 2019 with the executive order. It created the Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection, which is one of the divisions that I oversee and have a great staff. And I know a lot of you know a lot of them and have really done well in getting that office and this Resilient Florida program off the ground. But it also was, for the first time, the governor pushed for funding for resilience projects and coral reef protection, and that was kind of the initial kind of step in highlighting the need for resilience. And although that was a smaller grant program compared to the larger program that we oversee today, it really started some of the conversations and allowed for funding for water quality research on coral reefs and developing living shorelines and just some smaller projects that could address some of the impacts that we were seeing primarily in South Florida, in the Keys with a lot of the king tides. And it really was just a good kind of first step in having that discussion and having the state be pushing for resilience funding around the state. And then in 2021, in the governor's budget, it was the effort to really expand that into a bigger statewide resilience program. And that, with the support of the legislature, kind of evolved into the House Bill 1954, or Senate Bill 1954. And that was really a piece of landmark legislation. It created the Resilient Florida Grant Program, requiring local governments to do vulnerability assessments, establishing a statewide vulnerability data set that will be developed once those vulnerability assessments are done at a local level and get incorporated. We started a coastal mapping initiative, and really the kind of, the centerpiece was the getting a dedicated recurring funding source to receive projects that can protect critical assets and start working towards identifying those projects and getting some significant funding to allow those projects to be implemented. And with the dock stamp revenue, it establishes a pot of money. It's roughly about 125 million, depending on the number of dock stamps revenues per year. And then we, on top of that, have also received additional federal funding, which has allowed us to really kick off this Resilient Florida Grant Program. This prior session, we were able to award over $404 million worth of projects and funded 113 of those across the state, and really help prepare the coastal and inland communities to address the adverse impacts of flooding and sea level rise. We also created the first ever preliminary statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience plan, and that plan included 76 infrastructure projects across the state totaling more than $270 million. And lastly, this past session, or this prior year, we also awarded $20 million of vulnerability assessments, which is really the key to get local governments to do those vulnerability assessments, to do the research and the modeling, and to see exactly how sea level rise and flooding is going to impact their communities so that they can address the needs for protecting critical assets, and then all of that gets incorporated into our state plan, which then allows us to start identifying projects that are the most in need across the state. And one of the other things that has been done, I mentioned DOT, and in 2022 there was I guess you kind of call a glitch bill for 1954, and it was House Bill 7053. And that created the statewide Office of Resilience within the governor's office, and statutorily established the Chief Resiliency Officer, and also introduced the framework for the Florida Department of Transportation to complete resilience planning efforts for Florida's highway system. So the progress made to date is the direct result of the foresight and commitment of the legislature, the governor, and then the department to be able to implement those efforts. And we've been able to result in a strategic focus to be prepared, be more resilient, and protect our critical assets. We've been able to fund infrastructure projects such as power supplies, protecting drinking water resources, protecting evacuation routes. We've funded projects to relocate wastewater treatment facilities that were in areas that we know are going to be inundated, whether through sea level rise or storm surge, relocated police stations, firehouses, a lot of these areas that are really to the benefit of the public health and safety, as we look at addressing those critical assets that we know are threatened by not only just storm surges like we see from hurricanes, but just as we see sunny day tides creating those flooding scenarios, and knowing that those critical assets are going to need to be protected. And then this year, the department, we received an additional $200 million on top of the dedicated dock stamp revenue that will fund our statewide plan, year 2. Last year, the legislature funded the full 3 years of the first 3-year work plan, and so that allowed us to be able to resolicit. We received a lot of projects that we've been able to score and rank and will be moving forward on, and also got an additional $20 million. And no, it didn't steal all my thunder, but one of the things that this will allow us to do is to be able to have vulnerability assessments completed for all 67 counties across the state, which is a really big achievement that we've been able to do in just the last 2 years. And then, as you all are probably aware, the governor recently issued the new executive order continuing his vision for a better Florida environment. And before sharing some of the successes, or some of the highlights in the new EO, I just wanted to hit on some of our successes recognized by the governor on the topic of resilience. The state, with the coordination of the Chief Resiliency Officer, we've invested more than $1.1 billion in resilience projects to protect our communities from flooding and sea level rise in the past 2 years. And in the next 4 years, we've been directed by the governor for the Chief Resiliency Office and DEP to build upon these efforts by helping expedite hurricane recovery from the devastating hurricanes of Ian and Nicole, continuing to build upon the success of our Resilient Florida grant program, completing all the vulnerability assessments for not just counties but also municipalities, and continuing to work with DOT to make Florida's transportation system more resilient. And we've also are establishing a coral reef restoration and recovery initiative to increase the state coral propagation and deployment capacity to restore these natural infrastructures to help enhance coastal flood and storm surge. Oh, sorry. There you go. And as you all know, resilience doesn't just stop or start there. One of the big efforts that the department oversees is beach restoration, renourishment, and we continue to our dedication to protect our beaches. Beaches really are the lifeblood that we've seen and has been discussed, the economic impacts, tourism, what brings people to Florida. Our beaches and waterways really are what we are really the most important asset, both from an environmental and an economic standpoint. And most importantly, they're also the first line of defense. Where you see large dune systems, that's where you see a lot less storm surge. There's areas of the state that suffer, that are critically eroded, that we know need to have nourishment projects to prevent storm surge from impacting upland structures. And as much as that we can use that to create natural environment, habitat, not only for turtles and birds, but also those, when you have a mature dune system, it really does protect and provide that first line of defense for storm surge. In the past 4 years, we've invested $250 million in beach nourishment and inland management, and continued addressing Florida's critically eroded shorelines, including $50 million in this year's budget. And when faced with the back-to-back hurricanes of Ian and Nicole, DEP, we were able to act quickly and committed $20 million for emergency sand placement for local governments to address some of the significant dune and beach erosion caused by those storms. Flagler and Volusia County have already received their grant awards for $5 million each, and working with Lee and Collier and Charlotte County as well. And then in December, the legislature and the governor signed the legislation that was developed during the special session to support expedite recovery of the counties hit hardest by these two devastating storms. And this included 3 grant programs that the department is currently in the process of doing the emergency rulemaking for, and establishing the online portal and application process to start moving on those grant applications as soon as the rules are finalized. And this included $100 million for beach restoration projects based on the recovery analysis that the department put together related to the 2 hurricanes, $50 million to assist homeowners with sand placement and potential armoring, and then $100 million for local governments in affected counties to apply for repairs to stormwater, wastewater systems damaged by these storms and that are a critical immediate threat to the populations. And then last but not least, $8 million for this current year budget is being dedicated to support 31 coral reef projects, including monitoring and support of stony coral tissue loss disease, restoration of the 350-mile reef track, and the enhancement of regional water quality with a focus on Biscayne Bay. Based on a lot of the research and monitoring, we know that some of the water quality that is impacting Biscayne Bay is also having impacts on our coral reefs, and the most that we can reduce stressors from algae nutrients, it will make them more resilient to some of the more just natural stressors, particularly with the stony coral tissue loss disease that we're seeing and experiencing currently. And then lastly, just as far as what the department's been able to accomplish, land acquisition remains a high priority of the agency. These lands help create buffers to protect coastal uplands from flooding, sea level rise, and storm surge, recharge our aquifers to reduce saltwater intrusion, and provide critical habitat to endangered species. And over the last 4 years, Florida has committed over $600 million to the Florida Forever program, over 5 times the investment during the previous 4 years, and been able to acquire nearly 159,000 acres for conservation. So far in 2022, an additional 22,600 acres of conservation land has been acquired through the Florida Forever program. And then, as I mentioned, DEP, we're not the only agency taking action to protect our assets. Under the Governor DeSantis, FDOT's resilience policy focuses on sea level rise, flooding, and storm events, and identifies implementation strategies through planning, project development, design, construction, operations, and maintenance of transportation facilities. FDOT plans, designs, and prioritizes solutions based on 3 key areas of resiliency: enhancing their inventory to resist hurricane and storm events, provide local solutions for local rain and flooding, and enhance their inventory and designing new facilities to offset the impacts of rising sea levels. Resiliency has also been incorporated into their statewide long-range transportation planning efforts, including the Florida Transportation Plan. FDOT coordinates with the Federal Highway Administration, DEP, and various local municipalities to address resiliency as part of their drainage design approach while satisfying the applicable environmental permitting regulations. And then DOT works closely with Department of Emergency Management, Federal FEMA, Florida Highway Patrol, and other local and federal agencies to provide emergency response, weather awareness, and disaster relief. And finally, the Volkswagen settlement is an additional program that's been able to achieve some of the reductions in sources of carbon, been able to create and outline a spending plan that provides $166 million from the Volkswagen settlement. And this plan is focused on construction of new electric vehicle charging stations, procuring electric buses for select school districts, transit agencies, and providing funding for the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act. Through this settlement allotment, DEP has awarded grants to install 150 electric vehicle charging stations along the state highway system. And these projects also include marine engine replacements, an electric freight switch at port cargo handling, and other transportation-related carbon reducing projects. And so, that's just a kind of high-level overview of what DEP, FDOT, I know there's other agencies also involved in resilience and flooding projects around the state. But I really appreciate the time to be able to be here and talk to you all about what the department is doing, and happy to answer any questions afterwards or meet with anybody to discuss any of the programs that our office implements. So thank you very much.
Now I would like to introduce Jennifer Hecker, the Executive Director of the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership, part of the U.S. EPA National Estuary Program. Jennifer is responsible for working with stakeholders and local, state, and federal governments to protect and restore water and wildlife habitats in Central and Southwest Florida. She is a Science Advisory Committee member to Everglades Restoration and chair of the Environmental Advisory Committee for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. Please join and welcome Jennifer to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to run through this a little quicker, so bear with me. I just want to share some of the highlights of how the federal government is supporting regional resiliency efforts in this region, together with our state and local governmental partners. So first, a little bit about the CHNEP. We are part of, as you just heard, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's National Estuary Program. We're one of only 28 funded and designated by Congress to protect estuaries of national significance. The CHNEP area encompasses 5,416 square miles, including Lemon and Donna and Roberts Bays up in Sarasota County, Charlotte Harbor in Charlotte County, and the Caloosahatchee Estuary and Estero Bay in Lee County, as well as their entire watersheds, which stretch across 6 inland counties from Polk down to Hendry. The partnership is comprised of local, state, and federal governmental members, as well as non-governmental organizations who work to protect water and wildlife in this region. We convene our partners throughout the year to tackle regional problems that affect our natural resources and quality of life, which of course includes climate change. Just this last week, we had our management committee meet with 13 federal agencies to discuss Hurricane Ian and resiliency needs, as well as a researcher from the National Laboratory who analyzed Hurricane Ian and found that it dropped 17% more precipitation due to climate change factors. This information is critical to raise awareness and understanding of what we need to do to adapt, mitigate, and lessen the impacts of sea level rise and other climate factors in our region. This is an exciting time with record investments being made to address climate change and to enhance resiliency. The recent federal bipartisan infrastructure law bill funds are providing us at an additional $1 million a year over the next 5 years to the CHNEP to support resiliency work in our region. Millions each year to numerous other federal agencies are also being dispensed in Florida, as well as $275 million directly to the state of Florida, focusing on clean and drinking water infrastructure improvements. This is accelerating the ability to undertake projects to know what and how we can further do to become more resilient as a region and a state. And this is timely in that climate change, once spoken of as a future event, is now clearly bearing down upon us. CHNP has a collective strategic plan called the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. This was written by all of our federal, state, and local governmental partners, and it took over 2 years. And it aims to implement these objectives using research, restoration, education around our 4 priority action plans, which is water quality improvement, hydrological restoration, fish, wildlife, and habitat protection, and public engagement. Resiliency obviously is interwoven into each of these actions. So we look through the lens of how to make our wildlife habitat more resilient, how to make our water resources more resilient, and how to engage the public in these resiliency efforts. Our 3-pronged strategy to enhancing resiliency is that we first need to enhance climate understanding and engagement. There's more scientific work to identify potential impacts and adaptation mitigation actions, more consensus building needed to engage policymakers and stakeholders, and more education is needed to engage and educate our public citizens. We also need to consider fighting water with water, pushing more clean fresh water through hydrological restoration out to our coasts and other water quality initiatives to combat saltwater intrusion and wetland drying from increased evapotranspiration inland, and we'll talk about this briefly later in the presentation. We also need to look at giving wildlife and habitat pathways to migrate inward in response to climate-induced vegetative community shifts, helping to build healthy habitats and increased populations of wildlife that can better cope with climate stressors that will buy them time to adapt by aiding them through seagrass plantings, oyster restoration, and other restoration measures. So then we're going to talk now briefly about how do we actually do these things. First, with regards to enhancing climate understanding and engagement. We work with professionals in the public, and we organize different events, such as our annual climate summit, which you all are at a climate summit today. We are going to host another one on March 15th and 16th, where we bring together the public, scientists, and elected leaders to exchange information on how to advance regional resiliency. These have included keynotes from Senator Marco Rubio, Chief Resiliency Officer Dr. Wesley Wolf, and other federal and state leaders, as well as leading scientists and local leaders. We also provide centralized data sharing online through the CHNP Water Atlas website, which this year we are adding new interactive climate data mapper tools on each of the water body pages. So if you're interested, you can go online and Google CHNP Water Atlas, and you'll start to see the information that's already there and that will be added over the course of this year. We also provide cities and counties assistance in creating vulnerability assessments. The CHNP co-authored the first vulnerability assessment in the region back in 2009, and we assisted in its updating in 2019 for the city of Punta Gorda. We're now embarking to hire contractors to assist in other counties as well, and we'll talk briefly about that as well. So, sorry if I'm behind here. Okay, not sure I'm going the right way here. Just bear with me a minute here. Okay, we're back on track. So Deputy Secretary Blaylock talked about vulnerability assessments and how they are integral into enhancing regional resiliency. We are so glad to be working alongside the state with this. We've dedicated $400,000 per year over the next 5 years to ensure that the 10 counties that we serve have the most comprehensive vulnerability assessments that meet all the state statute requirements. And we also hope to bring in some added components to look at environmental justice and other features that enhance resiliency across the community. With regards to fighting water with water, we have created watershed restoration models based on real-world data to understand where and how water is needed in order to move it from where it is harmful to where it can be helpful. where it can restore natural areas and waterways, including the South Charlotte, North Lee County, Charlotte Harbor watershed, and the South Lee County Estero Bay watershed. And we're now working on implementing hydrological restoration projects to remove barriers and enhance flow to natural areas in these areas, based on these modeling recommendations. I'm just going to briefly show you, these are some of the findings. You can see here on the left the existing conditions, and on the right the pre-development conditions for the Estero Bay watershed. So the South Lee County watershed study, which is what this was from, evaluated the impacts of climate change on watershed hydrology. It suggested that reduced wetland hydro period, which is the length of time that water stands on wetlands above ground, reduced water depths, reduced stream flows, and higher tidal water levels will be experienced by 2050. This study assumed higher rates of evapotranspiration resulting from a warming climate. The range of rainfall forecasts were reviewed during the development of the climate change scenario. Because the rainfall at that time was somewhat uncertain, no changes were made to the overall average rainfall input, but still nonetheless, that increased evapotranspiration, the rate that the moisture is wicked up into the atmosphere, did show that there would be increased drying in the region that could affect wetland resources such as the Corkscrew Swamp by 2050. So what it really does is inform us that not only do we need to hydrologically restore based on existing conditions, but we need to look to the future and even do more to mitigate some of the anticipated impacts of climate change on our region. This here is just a diagram very briefly on where we see the greatest hydro period differences, meaning again how the water levels change, how long it's wet in different areas, or how in areas it'll become drier. This is looking at two future condition scenarios. One on the left is maximum restoration, and on the right is maximum allowable development. And you can see large areas of improved hydro periods in the greens and blues on the left map, where on the right you'll see more limited greens and blues tied to primarily new development constructed wetland retention ponds and displacement of water from developed areas into adjacent areas, while you'll also see the increased yellows and reds, which indicate where it will become drier. So we also look at giving wildlife and habitat pathways and spaces to migrate to. And to do this, we've created a habitat migration and restoration needs model that looks at the impact of sea level rise to vegetation in coastal areas and how it will shift in response, as well as evapotranspiration rates on vegetation and inland CH&EP areas. This helps to guide habitat acquisition and restoration to create continuous corridors and habitat areas for wildlife to use as climate change impacts their current habitat. Now we're working with the city of Punta Gorda, who just recently received a Resiliency Florida grant in addition to CH&EP funding, and the Nature Conservancy on building the Tiki Point Living Shoreline Project to build mangroves and oyster reefs around a front of a vulnerable sea-walled shoreline and low-lying urban area in the city of Punta Gorda, which will provide added habitat as well as buffering and protection of the community from storm surge and wave action. So just finally in closing, there's many ways to stay informed and engaged. We encourage you to reach out with your friends and families and have them subscribe for free publications, including our quarterly magazine and our annual calendar. I have complimentary copies for everyone out in the lobby. The inset this year is on blue carbon and how that can help mitigate the impacts of climate change. There's also ways to follow us to find out about free volunteer events, to look at recorded videos, including from prominent scientists and other leaders on our YouTube channel, and also to hopefully stay engaged by coming to the next climate summit scheduled in March. So with that, I just thank you again today for being here. Together through partnering and your help, we can ensure that Central and Southwest Florida has resilient waterways and wildlife populations for generations to come. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Carolina Moran, the District Resiliency Officer with the Southwest Florida Water Management District. She has nearly 20 years of experience working on water resource planning, water management and regulation, and climate resiliency. Carolina will talk about the newest resiliency plan for the Water Management District.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having the district participating in this event today. Bear with me. I'm also trying to get some of the time here, and I have a strong accent, so I hope you can all go with me through those slides. So we are one of 5 water management districts in Florida. We are the largest one in South Florida. We encompass the area that we are here today, so all the way up to Fort Myers. We manage water mainly for with the goals of restoring and enhancing ecological functions. So this is a little bit of what we summarize with this image here on the bottom left. We also manage water for the purpose of flood protection, mainly in urban, dense areas, also some flood protection associated with agricultural. And both by restoring ecological functions and managing flood, we also need to find a balance to ensure that we protect our water sources. So we also manage water with the purpose of ensuring sustainable water supply sources to all the different needs throughout the region. For all of that, of course, we need to balance the needs. We don't have that much flexibility in the system, and especially under those evolving conditions that we are seeing today with changing rainfall patterns, with sea level rise, we are already finding some limitations on how we can operate and how effective we are to achieve all those goals. I know Dr. Savarese gave an excellent introduction about the hurricane itself and what is the magnitude of this event here for South Florida. But of course, I wanted just to point that this represents one more example, significant example of how those changing conditions might be impacting our region. And from a water management perspective, what I have here in this slide is just what we saw in terms of surge. This is one of the coastal structures here in Naples. This is COCO 1. So you can see that we found a peak stage of 10.3 NGVD. This represents 7.3 feet of surge in this location. We exceeded all the design. It was a new record for the district in this location. We had surge coming, 400 CFS coming inland in this area. Recovery to the normal levels took 12 hours, but really for us to regain communication with the tower and regain control of this gate, we lock it open. We do that during major storms. Of course, we would do that through Ian. To regain really control of that gate, it took us almost 5 days. So during this entire time, we were exacerbating flood conditions upstream, depending on how we were seeing surge and tide occurrences, and we were also not giving the full protection to water supply sources by not having the ability to stop surge and saltwater intrusion in this location. Regarding rainfall, another way that we really have to be paying close attention to how we manage our levels and operations. What we see here, I'm just presenting data within our boundaries. What we see here everywhere in dark red, it's rainfall that was above a 200-year recurrence period. So we saw significant rainfall. Record here in an East Lake Tahoe of 14.83 inches occurring for the total event. And again, extreme rainfall occurring in a large extent of the territory and impacting a lot on how we manage water in the region that we had to go through this storm. Sorry to jump quickly through these slides, but what I have here is just lake levels throughout the upper Kissimmee Basin during the entire storm. We can see that the line in most of those graphs, the higher line that we have in each of them is what we call a safer development line. And we can see that during extensive periods of time, those lakes were above this safe development line, which of course result in extreme operations from us, installation of large, massive pumps, temporary pumps throughout those lakes, and really finding the way that we could manage lake levels there and restore conditions as soon as possible to all those impacted communities. Data from this event makes very evident that our challenge to find this balance between all those water goals and really enhance quality of life in our communities and in the environment is also it's really a challenge. We have been looking at resiliency from a comprehensive way to really expand all the monitoring, understand what this data mean, understand what kind of trends we are seeing and how the system is evolving. We are advancing future conditions assessments, so making sure our models are looking at future conditions and how those are evolving into the future. Based on those model results, looking at how we harden infrastructure, how we make investments in an effective way. We have limited resources. The costs for those investments are high, and we are finding ways that we can really harden our infrastructure to the right scenario in the future, and mainly looking at effective use of the investments, limited investments that we have. Continuing to restore natural systems, we have seen, and we are really seeing more and more how our ecological functions, restoration and enhancement is really contributing to build resiliency in the region, along with several other measures, and really promoting and partnering with all the stakeholders, all the local governments, all the partners that we have in the region. So in terms of our plan, this is the main goal for the presentation today. This is the third year that we are building. I will use the word building our plan because this is also an evolving document. So since year 1, 2, and now the third year, we are getting the major outputs from those models and tools that we have in the district, looking at flood vulnerability, also beginning to look at water supply vulnerability, and really finding how we can make strong recommendations in terms of infrastructure investments. So we do have a list of priority projects there based on available results that we have to the models that we were able to accomplish so far, and also relying upon extensive expertise that we have in-house and in collaboration with our partners that are also looking at vulnerability assessments. So really leveraging information, tools, assessments that are all being done in the region. One of the projects that we have in the plan that is particularly important to this region is what we call self-preservation mode, is really enhancing hardening those coastal structures. I mentioned to you the 5 days that we lack communication with our COCO 1 structure here in the West Coast. So this will give us increased capacity to just build, like hardening the structure to regain control, to perhaps not even lose control depending on the significance, the magnitude of the events. So we are really focusing on enhancing electronic, mechanical components and communication with the towers so we can really provide the protection that we need and the reliance that we need in this region of significant assets that we have throughout the coast, both on the west and the east and west coast. I know Dr. Steve Davis will come next and we'll talk about that, so I don't want to use any of this time. He'll talk about this way better than me, but it's very important to, as I mentioned, all the completed restoration projects are increasing the region's ability to manage those water and extreme weather events. We really consider those our largest nature-based features. We have significant progress in the region, and we are going to continue to do that. We also mentioned the recent executive order for Governor DeSantis, allowing us to continue to further advance the protection of water, Florida environment and water quality, really ramping up efforts there and dedicating a whole section on resiliency efforts through FDP Resilient Florida program as well, which we are partnering and hoping to also enhance even further our collaboration and funding to advance those projects. We have a forum. We understand that those problems are complex. To find the balance, we need to collaborate with our partners, with the local governments. So we have established our Resilience Coordination Forum with all 16 counties here within our boundaries. Our second meeting is coming now on March 1st. We are asking for suggestions, recommendations on topics, how we can further engage, and really hoping to build leverage tools, leverage efforts, leverage resources that we have in the region so we can collaborate and really give the right answers to the problems that we have here. I'm going to skip that just to mention that, of course, we understand there are several layers. We are working together with all those multiple layers that we have. What we have here is collaboration. What we see through this event is collaboration between governments. This is what we believe is the solution, an important step for us to finding the solution in the region. And with that, I'm going to end just by saying that water management and resiliency really underpins all we need to do here in the region, and I appreciate the opportunity to come here and share with you some of the visions from the water management.
To round out session 2, I would like to introduce Steve Davis, the Chief Scientist for the Everglades Foundation. Steve leads the Science Department and Science Communication efforts focused on advancing Everglades restoration, tracking ecosystem health, and understanding the impacts of sea level rise. An aquatic ecologist, he has 27 years of research experience in the coastal Everglades. Steve will highlight why Everglades restoration is essential to building resilience in South Florida.
Well, I realize I'm up against a break here. I was told that I was batting cleanup, so I'll try to be expeditious with this time that I have, but it really builds on what the previous speakers have talked about, that Everglades restoration is an enormous resilience builder for South Florida, for the state in general. In fact, recently, the Assistant Secretary of the Army, Mike Connor, was presenting before Congress, and he was asked about resilience projects in Florida. And he said that the South Florida Ecosystem Restoration Program is a fundamental resilience builder for South Florida. And how it does that really is it seeks to undo much of the damage that the Central and Southern Florida project did to South Florida. Now, these are zoomed in maps of primarily the river of grass connected from Lake Okeechobee all the way to the south. This doesn't show all the southwest coast of Florida, the Florida Keys, even the watershed north of Lake Okeechobee that have all been impacted by these changes in water management. But we know that the system is drier. We know that it's vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. We know that we're losing biodiversity. We're losing soil elevation. We're also seeing that our water supply is impacted, and that climate change poses an even greater risk looking ahead in terms of the impacts of sea level rise, changes in rainfall, rising temperatures. Restoration is really the solution to this. And my organization, the Everglades Foundation, comes at this from a science-based approach. And we partner with a variety of non-governmental organizations, the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation on this coast, similar organizations on the East Coast and then throughout the Florida Keys to really move this effort forward. This is a $25 billion infrastructure program, and we know that it's infrastructure that caused this harm, but it's really infrastructure that's needed to get us out of this problem, and I'll highlight some of those efforts shortly. But it's fundamentally about South Florida's water supply. We get our water from either aquifers under the ground or surface water supplies that are all connected to this ecosystem in one way or another, and dependent upon the 4 to 5 feet of rainfall that we get each year, 75% of that falling within the wet season. Hurricane Ian, obviously, as Dr. Moran showed, delivered enormous quantities of rainfall. In fact, we've seen over 1 trillion gallons of water coming down the Kissimmee Basin, filling up Lake Okeechobee. And it's the infrastructure that the Kissimmee River restoration provided in helping to slow and store some of that water. The reinforcement of the dike, Herbert Hoover Dike around Lake Okeechobee, that's helped to ensure that we can hold that water in the lake without impacting communities and reducing those unwanted releases. So we know that this system's important from our water supply perspective, but as Dr. Moran also mentioned, from a water management perspective. I want to zoom in on this carbon story because we generally think of the Everglades as a biodiverse ecosystem that's valuable from the standpoint of the unique habitats and wildlife that we see, the fishing that provides us around the coast, obviously the benefits to our real estate values, but it really all depends on the carbon that's been sequestered in this ecosystem over thousands of years. And when we drain the Everglades, particularly that large agricultural area to the south, we expose these carbon soils, these peat soils that had been accumulating, again, for thousands of years, to oxygen and allowing that soil to degrade very rapidly. In some areas, that agricultural area south of the lake, we've lost over 6 feet of soil elevation. Being a flat, low-lying landscape here in South Florida, the last thing we want to do is lose elevation. But what that also means is that we're emitting carbon back out to the atmosphere. And over the history of drainage of this ecosystem, we've lost almost a gigaton of carbon. And to put a gigaton into perspective, that's 1 billion metric tons. That's 2 trillion pounds. That's more than the mass of every single human being on the planet, twice over. We've lost that much carbon from this ecosystem, and it's emitted back out to the atmosphere. So not only are we seeing the consequences of draining this ecosystem, but we're actually contributing to the climate change problem that we're experiencing and here, obviously, to talk about. To zoom in on this problem and literally get into the weeds, these peat soils, they're not a stable surface. It requires Everglades wetland conditions for these soils to gradually build up over time. But we know when we drain these wetlands, and there are many areas across the Everglades that are too dry for too long, and we even experience soil fires in some areas. These soils are lost very rapidly. We've also been learning through science in collaborations with scientists at FIU and even some of the work that Dr. Savarese has done here at Florida Gulf Coast, that these soils are vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. So when you consider the fact that we've reduced the flow of freshwater off the landscape, and this kind of harkens what Jennifer Hecker was talking about in her presentation, fighting saltwater with freshwater, by reducing freshwater flow, we've only invited saltwater further into our coastal wetlands around this system, which has resulted in very rapid soil elevation loss to the point where we're calling it peak collapse. National Geographic covered this in one of their issues focused on climate change in national parks. And we've begun to look at vulnerability analysis. This is just an area along the southwestern corner of Everglades National Park, and the hotter areas we know to be the most vulnerable. And so the solution to this, obviously, is Everglades restoration, freshwater flow. We can't stop sea level rise, but right now there are times where the back door is open and this salt water is intruding unabated. And so we know by increasing freshwater flow through the various infrastructure projects, and obviously here in Collier County with the Picayune Strand, that's a smaller scale Everglades restoration effort, 55,000 acres. Anywhere else in the world, that would be an enormous restoration undertaking. That's just one project within the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. These infrastructure projects collectively, particularly the Everglades agricultural area south of Lake Okeechobee, will allow us to fight saltwater intrusion with fresh water, getting that water south, protecting these habitats, recharging our water supplies in South Florida, but at the same time, building estuarine resilience in the Caloosahatchee, in the St. Lucie, by reducing those unwanted, polluted, high-volume discharges to the east and the west. And I realize I'm a scientist. You've seen graphics. I can't help myself. We can't help ourselves when it comes to presenting data. But I really like this figure because it highlights what we can do with Everglades restoration. This is sending fresh water across Tamiami Trail into Everglades National Park all the way down to the coast, following that white arrow. And the more fresh water we can get downstream, the more we can push back against that saltwater intrusion, protecting these habitats. But it's not year-round where we really deliver benefits. It's in the driest of the dry season months where we stand to gain the greatest impacts in terms of benefits and slowing this rapid unraveling of our coastal ecosystems in South Florida. We've also done downscaling of climate outputs and looked at the impacts of climate change scenarios on our water availability in South Florida. And what these show is that with increasingly dire climate change outcomes, we have a much drier South Florida ecosystem. Everglades, Lake Okeechobee, the fresh water needed for our estuaries and coastal waters. What this speaks to is a need to advance restoration even sooner, because that provides the infrastructure to allow us to capture that water when it's in abundance and then pull from that when we know it's needed. And this is not something that we derive from our own science. This is from the collective body of understanding that Everglades restoration will build much needed resilience across South Florida in this ecosystem that we all depend on. Thank you.
Please welcome back our MC, Greg Tolley.
I like the way he said that. Greg Tully. I want to thank Adam, I want to thank Jennifer, Carolina, Steve for your valuable insight, and also for the hard work that you and your organizations do in protecting our environment in the region and the state. Before we take a quick break, I have some instructions for you here. So we're going to take a quick 10-minute break, but while you're doing so, you might take a look at that read ahead. There's a kind of a conversation starter document in your handbook and your workbook there. Take a look at that. You're going to be coming back to tables that correspond with the strategies number on your name badge. So take a look at that number. That's the table you're going to come back to start having some conversations about some strategies we can use to combat climate change here specifically within this region. So read that little read ahead. Make sure you bring your workbook with you. You'll be writing in that. So right now we're going to take a 10-minute break. There are snacks and beverages out in the lobby. That we also have a number of tables set up. Make sure you check those out. Some of those organizations are doing some remarkable work here in Southwest Florida. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in 10.